United States Department of Agriculture.
Sorry about this. It just doesn't have focus. Can you move the thing?
Yeah, and then
Okay. Great, thanks. So this just highlights some of the technical difficulties. This is the first in-person meeting at the National Agricultural Library since pre-pandemic times. So we are getting all of the bugs out of the technical systems and learning what works and what doesn't work. So it's been a very interesting week. But this picture shows our kickoff meeting in December 2019 for the current project that we're funded on that allowed us to develop the tools and protocols and methods for ARDN, the Agricultural Research Data Network. So that date is a little auspicious. That's, a couple months later, we were all locked down into these little boxes. And for the remainder of the project until today, or until this week, we were doing our collaborative research solely through Zoom, right? So, and I know everybody around the world has had the same exact problems, but we found ways to make it work by holding these mini hackathons. We would get together on Zoom once a month for a pretty much all-day meeting to work through the design of the infrastructure, implementation, and the data protocols that we've been developing. But the ARDN story goes back long before the beginning of this current NEPA-funded project. So a lot of the tools and methods that we're using come from AgMIP, which is the Agricultural Model Intercomparison Improvement Project, and even before that. So prior to AgMIP, modeling groups around the world didn't always get along well together or cooperate on things. There was little to no protocols for applying models and comparing models and improving models. It wasn't quite as bad as a shootout at the OK Corral like this picture shows, but the groups were not working well together. So in 2008, at a workshop in St. Pete Beach, Florida, the origins of AgMIP were conceived in a hallway conversation between Jim Jones, Cynthia Rosenzweig, Jerry Hatfield, and John Antle. And they decided that we need a long-term, rigorous way of improving models, improving all models, and coming up with ways that we can better characterize the responses that we model to things like climate change. And without that rigorous long-term systematic approach, we weren't going to be able to solve some of the big problems that we face. And so that began AgMIP. First funding came through in 2010 from ARS to get that first workshop going. And of course, what we're concerned with here, so AgMIP has a lot of moving parts, but what we're concerned with here in ARDN is the data interoperability protocols that were developed to support ensemble modeling activities in AgMIP. And so AgMIP really is a global community of science. So there were scientists from all over the world, many different modeling communities. So it included climate modeling, crop and livestock modeling, and socioeconomic modeling. So it wasn't just all about crop modeling. And this just shows some of the group pictures of meetings around the world. A few very high profile papers have come out of the AgMIP crop model intercomparisons. This is the first of those papers where a lot of the protocols were hammered out. This is Sentinel to Sang, publishing and about, I think, 50 co-authors publishing in Nature Climate Change about the outcome of ensemble modeling. So they did a wheat model intercomparison, and there were 30 wheat models that they used. Nobody even knew 30 wheat models existed in the world at that time, but they all got together. They did an intercomparison and learned some pretty interesting things. One of them being that the median of the crop model predictions was more accurate than any single model across many different environments. Nobody wanted to do that one ahead of time. And we got consistent messages from other model intercomparisons for rice and maize. And these intercomparisons are continuing largely unfunded volunteer work. This is the latest model intercomparison paper that I'm aware of that just came out a few months ago on the soybean intercomparison. Just to illustrate that it is, AgMIP is still very active. So what did we learn from AgMIP? A couple of things we learned is the need for uniform data sources to provide to these ensembles of models for modeling activities. And so AgMIP had to develop methods that would allow that to happen. We needed a consistent vocabulary. So not just for modeling, crop modeling data, but for modelers of different domains to talk to each other. For instance, we went from climate data and models to crop and livestock models to socioeconomic models. And just a term as benign as baseline means something totally different to the crop modelers as it does to the socioeconomic models. So we had to lay down this common vocabulary. Another thing we learned is that everybody already has their own way of doing things. When we started out talking about data interoperability and AgMIP, we really thought we could impose a new standard that everybody would conform to and everybody would be happy about doing that. Well, we quickly learned that that's not the case and that there's already enough standards out there. One more standard is just going to create one more standard. So what we needed to do was learn how to work with people the way that they already do business and be able to transfer data from one protocol to another easily. And another lesson we learned is that the protocols that were developed by a community for a community result in acceptance and adoption by that community. So somewhere along the way during the AgMIP times, we had a USDA AgMIP data harmonization workshop right here in this building, in this room at NAL back in May 2015. For the purposes of taking some of these AgMIP protocols, applying them to USDA data. I can remember Jerry Hatfield himself coding up his data for use in AgMIP. Like he didn't even delegate it to somebody else. He did all that himself at this workshop. So that was pretty cool. We talked about vocabularies for different agricultural domains. We worked with a dairy person. We worked with pest and disease data. And so that was one of the first times that we took AgMIP protocols and tried to really work with a wider community. Then about 2017, we started working with the CGIAR, the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research. So these are the big international agricultural research facilities around the world. And they were developing this big data platform. And so Meta Devara was project manager for one component of that big data platform. And we worked with her on these data annotation protocols for their system that now have been wrapped up into what we're doing in the current project in ARDN. Meta's going to talk right after lunch today. She's going to present how they have implemented VMapper and some of our other ARDN tools into their fair data workflow within CGIAR. So it's really cool that what we're doing here with USDA is compatible with what's being done at international research institutions. And then 2019, we started this 3-year NEFA-funded project for Agricultural Research Data Network. So it's building on all of these other things. It's building on what was done in AgMIP and what was done with the CGIAR. We extended the data annotation protocols for use on Ag Data Commons, built some more robust translators, and basically we're wrapping up this meeting today. We're wrapping up that 3-year project and presenting the work that we've done. And just one more thing to note, IFDC, the International Fertilizer Development Center, has been a partner from the beginning when we were working with AgMIP and all the way through the present day with co-developing methods and tools, and also sort of being our guinea pig for implementing some of these translators and making the vocabulary more robust for the types of data that they collect with their, especially with micronutrients and such. Okay, so to describe what our motivating, what really motivates our desire to work on data interoperability for agricultural research data is that we recognize that there's a huge gap between the potential value of data that we get from agricultural research and the value that we're actually getting from those data. And so, as an example, data are collected in an experiment. They're used to, for some very specific research purpose. You write a paper, you get it published, people cite it, but the data behind that often are lost after the original research is over. And so we feel like if we could collect those data across many different years, across many different locations, different genetics, different management, and pull them all together and use it as a collective resource, that those data could have much greater value. And so in the FAIR data principles, we are working primarily in this interoperable and reusable portion. So what we're trying to do is bridge the gap between the supply of data on one hand and the demand for data on the other. And with some of the challenges being that these data are in different physical locations, they use different vocabularies, different formats and schemas and so on. So how do we take these data in the condition that they exist, but still be able to interpret them, combine them, and use them for further research? So we started with some existing AgMIP translators. So this is sort of the end user side, the data demand side. We added these annotation files using standard vocabularies. We interpret the contents and the format of the data sets in an automated way. Once we've annotated them, we understand what is contained within the data sets. We added some new translators for conversion from the raw data to this AgMIP format, this harmonized format that was designed for AgMIP, and add some additional translators for end users. So this slide shows one of the use cases that we developed for the project. In this case, we have a crop modeler who wants to do a search for her study in Tanzania. And this depiction is with the Guardian CGIAR data and publication portal. It could just as easily have been Ag Data Commons as shown here, because the concept is exactly the same. So she puts in a few search terms. She wants her data to be ARDNized. She wants it to be compatible with ARDN such that she can get model-ready data out of it. So within the Guardian API and search engine, it goes out and checks through her search terms. It's looking at these data annotation files that are available for ARDN data sets on the portal, identifying some external data sets that are sitting out in remote repositories perhaps, and bringing the data together and then translating it for the specific crop models that she is interested in. It's never quite this cut and dry. For example, even very, very detailed data sets don't have every single piece of information that you need to run a model. So there's always sort of an iterative process to prepare those data, fill in the missing gaps, and go about your modeling. But the ARDN tools can get us, 90–95% of the way there. A second use case that we use to drive the work that we're doing is that we envision that if you could collect enough information from field crop experiments that you could combine across environment and management and genetics, that could help drive the development of new gene-based models. Because now if we can take these data, combine them with genetic data, you can actually build models that will take the genetic data and predict what would happen in any environment, even without growing the crop there. So there are folks working on this already. There's a lot of work being done on this. It's sort of in its infancy, but it requires a tremendous amount of data. Okay, so the elements that we need to build a system, first of all, we wanted to use the existing technology that was available through AgMIP. We want the system to work with legacy data sets. So that is a data set that may have been archived in some repository. It's sitting out there with the DOI. You can't really change the format of the data set easily because it's a permanent archive, but we can annotate it. And we also want it to work with new data sets. So as we're collecting new data, if you do that with the proper vocabulary and the correct format, you may not need the annotation at all, but we can still use the AgMIP tools to translate it. We want the system to be non-proprietary, easily deployed, and platform independent. So I think we've checked all of those. We wanted to work with existing standards using a hub and spoke configuration. So on the right-hand side, I've got an illustration of what that means. So if you see the blue circles as being sources of data and the orange circles as being somebody who demands data in a certain format, the point-to-point would require a lot of translators to get from every single format on the left to every single format on the right. Whereas the hub and spoke allows us to go to the centralized hub format, which is the AgMIP crop experiment format, and have a few translators for a few data sources and a few translators for a few end user formats. Much more efficient way of handling data. Okay, so I've talked about this, and this slide describes what that means. So we've got, in this case, we're showing Ag Data Commons as being the central repository. There's some core metadata that already sits on Ag Data Commons with every data set. And we propose to add some additional, you can think of it as extended metadata in the form of these 3 sidecar files. Okay, so these files, the sidecar file 1 has variables in the data set mapped to ontological terms. So this allows data contents to be discovered through the semantic web. This was really important for the CGIAR, and that was developed during the phase where we worked with the big data platform. It was less important at or for the National Agricultural Library, so we have not fully implemented and developed that one in this project. Sidecar File 2 is where we've spent most of our time. This is the roadmap for translation. This gives us the ability to annotate the contents of a data set. Physically, where is the data located, a URL of where the raw data exists, where in the data set, which files in that data set are appropriate for at this particular end use, where physically on each sheet, which row it starts and ends, and also a mapping of each column to an ACASA variable. So ACASA, I'll get into that a little bit later, is our vocabulary that's been adopted for AgMIP and ARDN. Sidecar File 3 is a subset of the data which allows us to search and index the data, allowing fast, complex search and discovery of data sets, even without going out to the remote repository where the data may be physically located. So ARDN data has a few characteristics. These are typically agronomic research data from field crop experiments, perhaps from farm survey data or household survey data. They're point-based. Each piece of information is associated with a latitude and a longitude. So that is opposed to the sort of aggregated statistical type data that you might get from NAS, for example. These are point-based data. They're quantitative data. So we're interested in data that can be used in analytics or modeling. And they are associated, because they're point-based, they're associated with an environment, which is described by soil properties and typically daily weather data to describe that environment. A lot of experimental data do not include the soil and weather data. It's still acceptable to ARDNize data, but ideally it would include these environmental data as well. And the vocabulary that we use to describe ARDN data is defined by the ACASA Data Dictionary. So ACASA is the International Consortium for Agricultural Systems Analysis. That entity doesn't exist anymore, but it left this rich legacy of a data dictionary that was originally developed to document field crop experiments, but was ideal also for use in describing the kinds of terms that we use in AgMIP and ARDN. And we feel that the methods and the software developed for ARDN could be applied to other domains fairly easily. The idea is that you can kind of unplug a vocabulary and plug in a different vocabulary, but still use these tools to get the same goals of data harmonization. So over on the right, we have in the box, there is a list of a few of the data sets that we have ARDNized as part of this project. Most of these are up on Ag Data Commons now with the annotation files. So these vary a lot in extent and the type of research that was done with these data, including long-term ecological research data from the Kellogg Biological Station. The corn cap data, it has been annotated and is up on Ag Data Commons now. Variety trials, so this is quite different from detailed field experiments, but extremely valuable in that you have cultivar information from multiple environments over multiple years, and there's lots of data. The TerraRef is high throughput phenotyping data from a field in Maricopa, Arizona. So also very valuable data, and what's interesting about it is the data is fed from the breeding API, a breeding API BRAPI endpoint, which makes it a little bit different in access of those data. And a few other data sets that have been added as we've gone through this process. So this is the ARDN data sharing workflows. So there's 4 interconnecting workflows that are shown here, starting with the ARDN data provider tools. So prior to the conference today, we had 2 one-day workshops working with ARDN tools. So on the Tuesday workshop, we had groups, many of you may have been involved in that, but we had groups working with these data provider tools, VMapper in particular, to create the annotations for a data set or multiple data sets. So yeah, that was a good opportunity. We'll hear more about how the workshop went a little bit later today. And then we have a search and discovery workflow where data from ARDN data sets are made available through these additional sidecar files 1 and 3 to the greater world. So these are search tools that are based on the additional sidecar files that were developed for ARDN. On the upper right, we have the data end user tools. So mostly these were what were developed with the AgMIP data interoperability. So these are geared towards individual crop models. So it translates from the central format, the ACE-B format, to the very specific formats required by different crop models. And we've added some tabular data outputs for analytics. And also we've talked to data analysts that really like the ACE-B format itself. It's a JSON format, and they really prefer to do analytics directly from the JSON format. So there's various different end user formats. They're not even all listed on this figure. And then sitting in the middle of everything is the data translation API. So this takes the raw data and the annotation in the sidecar file too. So remember, that's sort of the roadmap for translation. And it has a translator that puts it into this hub format, that ACE-B format. It also houses the AgMIP translators that allow data to be prepared for end users. And it has that sidecar file 3 extractor, which extracts out of the ACE-B the data needed for search and discovery. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the data provider tools. We've got some ARDN data tools up at data.agmip.org/ARDN. And the VMapper tool, like I said, we spent the workshop on Tuesday talking about VMapper, and then yesterday, we worked on what's called the Data Factory. Those of you who were involved in some of the AgMIP regional integrated assessments remember a tool called Quad UI, desktop tool. This Data Factory here is actually Quad UI in a browser-based application. So let's look at VMapper a little bit. So VMapper looks like this. This is a screenshot from it. It brings up your data. It allows you to annotate column by column the raw data headers to the ACASA variable names. It allows you to convert your units. It checks for dimensional capability or compatibility. It allows you, if you've got your data organized in multiple tables, which many data sets, many of the large, complex, extensive data sets do, it will detect relational linkages between your tables and allow you also to check that and create your own linkages. You can do things like creating new columns of variables from existing columns of variables if your data set doesn't have exactly the right variable to map to a path set. And it allows you to do some user-defined data transformation. So it's a pretty nice tool. It's something we did not have in the AgMIP, early days when we were developing the data interoperability tools, and it's something that we wanted for a long time, and this project finally was able to allow us to get there. And a little bit about the AgMIP end user tools. So these were designed to bring data in from multiple inconsistent data sources into a hub format, which you can see. I know all of you in Zoom can't see my laser pointer, but in the middle is this harmonized data format that we're bringing data into. So that's sort of that hub for data exchange. And in addition to the data from the these multiple data sources, we wanted a way to provide data that was missing from the data sets, but we need it for modeling. And so the little Einstein guy over there on the right, that's our local expert who knows the agronomic systems that we're studying and who we ask questions about, well, what is the row spacing of peanut and northern ground? Things like that, that you don't get from the data, but maybe you need it for a model. So that set of assumptions is combined with the actual data into the crop model translators that then translate information to the very specific formats needed for multiple models. And we went a little bit further with the AgMIP in that we harvested the outputs from the crop models and put them into a harmonized format as well. All of this was done in a series of hackathons. This one shows us at Texas Advanced Computer Center in 2013. And we ended up with a library or libraries of data translation tools for all these different models that could be then deployed in desktop applications and in gridded modeling applications and in browser-based applications. So it was a very flexible way to deploy these tools. Okay, so the next thing I want to show is the data factory. This is, I've mentioned it already, but this is where we had a workshop on Wednesday, yesterday, to take the data that had been harmonized using ARDN tools and actually apply it in models. So basically using the AgMIP translators to do that. This is a screenshot of what that data factory looks like. It's again available at data.agmip.org/ARDN. You load in your data that you've prepared previously. You load in what we call a field overlay DOM, which is that's the assumptions for the data that are missing from the data set. A linkage file to combine those two data streams in the correct way. And then finally, it allows us to output to whatever formats we want that are within the list of translators that we have for end users. So in this case, we have translators selected for DSAT, APSIN, and STIX models. Okay, so through this data workflow process that we've got, this end-to-end where you annotate data and then translate it to end-user formats, we end up with some artifacts. And so we start out with the raw data in some archive, and we annotate that data with our sidecar files, 1, 2, and 3. Those are all in JSON format. They're not particularly human readable, but typically a human doesn't have to read them. And then when we translate those data to that hub format, we get an ACE-B file. ACE-B stands for AgMIP crop experiment binary. So that's another artifact that we end up with. We have supplemental data files that allow us to provide those assumptions. So filling in missing data before we try to model this experiment. We can end up with model-ready input files. So that's what that data factory gives us, is it takes the DOM and the ASB and translates it to a model-ready format. And then finally, we end up with model output files after we've run the simulations. So all of these data artifacts are related to that original data, okay? And we want to have the ability to archive those and link them to the data that they originally came from and give credit to that original data set. So this workflow is a little bit messy. The big thing I want to emphasize here is the gray box on the right that says Ag Data Commons, data, metadata, and workflow. So what we have here is within Ag Data Commons, we have the original data set, but we also have a separate data set that is ARDN products. Okay, and these are, they are linked. This is linked as a, forget the Ag Data Commons terminology, but it's a resource. It's a data resource. And so because it is a data resource, it is linked to the original data. And it can include the sidecar file 2, the sidecar file 3, the ASB. It could even include the model input files and the model output files. It could include multiple SC2s. You might have two people that made different assumptions about the model. So all of these things are associated with that original data set on Ag Data Commons. Okay, that's how it's all linked together. We also, in the yellow box, there's sort of a procedure for iteratively preparing that sidecar file 2, and when it's ready, all your data and your sidecar file 2 can be archived and so on. So all of the ARDN tools, data, protocols, apps, information, methods, everything is open source. We want people to access these. We want them to be used. We hope that people will use them and add to them and give back, using the GitHub repositories. So these software products were developed by and for the community of users. We've gotten a lot of input from people on how to do this. It came out of AgMIP, which definitely was, a global community to develop these methods and tools. So back in the early days of AgMIP, we joked that we were building the plane in flight because the tools that we were developing at that time were needed right away by the people who were doing regional integrated assessment. So we always felt like we didn't have enough time to build this infrastructure. Now this ARDN project has allowed us to create this sleek new product. And I'm totally kidding. This is where we'd like to be. We're not there yet, right? We're on our way there. We have a long way to go still.
And we're still building it.
Yeah, but I think this is what we have actually, is this firm foundation for, now we've got the basic tools that allow us to annotate data, but we've got a long way to go in implementing those tools and getting a critical mass of data sets organized such that they really are useful. We have to have some demonstration projects where we actually use these data in big modeling projects. So we still have a long way to go, but I do feel like now we've got this firm foundation that we can work from. And this afternoon, our wrap-up session will be about just this. Where do we need to go next? What's left undone, and how can we accomplish it? So I hope that everybody can join at that time. So I don't know how our time is doing, but do we have time for questions? Okay, so, yeah, are there any questions from anybody?
Starting route to one.
I know most of the folks in this room have heard this all before, but, but hopefully it might be something new to some folks that have connected remotely.
USDA is an equal opportunity provider, employer, and lender.